It was the turn of a new century. The year was 1901. France was in the midst of its Belle Époque, a beautiful era of art, optimism and progress. In the quiet, respectable city of Poitiers, known for its ancient churches and learned university, life moved at a gentle, predictable pace. The streets were clean, the citizens were proper, and secrets, if they existed, were kept behind tightly drawn curtains and locked doors. No one in Poitiers could have imagined the darkness that festered within the walls of one of its most esteemed households, a darkness that had remained hidden, silent and undisturbed for more than 2 decades, a lifetime stolen from a young woman whose only crime was to love. The city itself seemed to guard against such horrors. Poitiers was a place of stone and history, where generations of families lived and died, their reputations carefully built and fiercely protected. The Monnier family was one such pillar of the community. They were known for their wealth, their charity, and their unimpeachable social standing. Madame Louise Monnier, the matriarch, was a celebrated figure, even receiving an award from the Committee of Good Works for her generous contributions to the city. Her son Marcel was a brilliant lawyer, a former prefect who had a promising future. They were the picture of provincial aristocracy, the kind of family others looked up to, a symbol of order and decency. But behind the respectable facade of their home on Rue de la Visitation, a different story was unfolding. It was a story of unimaginable cruelty, a tale of a mother's will turned to iron and a daughter's life reduced to a living nightmare. For 25 long years, a secret was kept in an upstairs room, a room sealed from the world, a room where the sun never entered. The neighbors heard things sometimes, faint cries, whispers on the wind. But in a society where minding one's own business was a cardinal virtue, such things were easily dismissed. They were explained away as the ramblings of a troubled mind, the eccentricities of a wealthy family. No one dared to pull at the thread. The story of Blanche Monnier did not begin with a scream, but with a slow, creeping silence. It is a tale that questions the very nature of family, community, and the human capacity to look away from suffering. It forces us to ask a difficult question: how can a person simply vanish in plain sight? How can a life be erased while the world continues to turn just outside the window? In the heart of civilized France, in a home praised for its virtue, a woman was slowly starving, wasting away in darkness, forgotten by everyone but the very people who'd put her there. And the silence for 25 years was absolute. Before the darkness fell, Blanche Monnier was known as a beautiful and vivacious young woman. Born in 1849, she was described in contemporary accounts as having a cheerful disposition, with striking dark hair and captivating eyes. She was a socialite, part of the city's elite circle, and was considered quite a catch. She attended parties, enjoyed the arts, and lived the privileged life expected of the daughter of a prominent family. Her future seemed bright, full of promise, and destined for a respectable marriage that would only enhance her family's standing. She was, by all accounts, a daughter any mother would be proud of, a jewel in the Monnier family crown. The head of this family was Madame Louise Monnier, a woman of formidable reputation. She was a widow, but she commanded respect and authority throughout Poitiers. Her late husband had been the dean of the local university, and she carried the family name with an air of stern dignity. She was deeply religious and held traditional values with an unyielding grip. To the outside world, she was a model of piety and charity, but beneath the surface there was a coldness, an inflexibility that would prove to be monstrous. Her love was conditional, her approval a prize to be earned, and her disappointment a force to be feared. She expected absolute obedience from her children, Blanche and her older brother Marcel. Marcel Monnier was the golden child. He followed the path his mother had laid out for him, becoming a successful lawyer and a respected public official. He lived in the family home, even after he married and had children of his own. He was intelligent and ambitious, a man who understood the importance of maintaining the family's pristine reputation. He was his mother's son, moulded by her expectations and her rigid sense of propriety. His career was flourishing, and he was careful not to do anything that might jeopardize his or his family's position in the tight-knit community of Poitiers. His loyalty was to the family name, first and foremost. This was the family unit, a powerful, controlling mother, a successful, compliant son, and a beautiful, spirited daughter. On the surface, they were the very definition of bourgeois respectability. They moved in the right circles, said the right things, and adhered to all the unspoken rules of their social class. Their home was a place of order, a reflection of their public image. But within that carefully constructed world, there was little room for deviation. There was no space for a daughter to have a will of her own, to choose a path that did not align with her mother's grand design. And soon, Blanche would test those boundaries, with consequences no one could foresee. The trouble began, as it so often does, with love. By 1876, Blanche was 27 years old, past the typical age for marriage in her social circle. She had turned down several suitable suitors, much to her mother's frustration. Then she fell in love. The man she chose was not a wealthy aristocrat or a promising professional. He was a lawyer, but he was older, without a significant fortune, and a Protestant. In the eyes of Madame Monnier, he was entirely unsuitable, a stain on the family's Catholic upper-class reputation. She saw the match not as a union of love, but as an act of social defiance, a betrayal of everything she stood for. Madame Monnier forbade the relationship. She demanded that Blanche end it immediately. But Blanche, for the first time in her life, refused. She was deeply in love and was determined to marry the man she had chosen, regardless of her mother's disapproval. Arguments echoed through the grand house on Rue de la Visitation. The conflict between mother and daughter escalated from heated words to ultimatums. Madame Monnier could not fathom such disobedience. In her world, a daughter's duty was to her family, and Blanche's insistence on this inappropriate match was a direct challenge to her maternal authority and the family's honor. The battle of wills reached a breaking point. Madame Monnier, along with her son Marcel, allegedly conspired to end the affair through force. They presented Blanche with a terrible choice: give up the man she loved or face the consequences. When Blanche held firm, her mother enacted a horrific plan. She would not disown her daughter or cast her out. Instead, she would break her spirit. She locked Blanche in a small, dark room on the top floor of the house. The initial intention, perhaps, was to keep her there until she relented, until she came to her senses and agreed to abandon her love. It was meant to be a temporary, albeit cruel, punishment. But Blanche never relented, and her mother's heart never softened. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and the months into years. The man Blanche loved eventually died in 1885, but even his death did not bring her freedom. By then, the secret had taken on a life of its own. To release Blanche would be to admit what they had done, to face scandal and ruin. The punishment had morphed into a permanent state of being. The door remained locked. The shutters remained nailed shut. Blanche Monnier, the vibrant socialite, had vanished from the world, imprisoned in a living tomb just a few feet above the very streets where she once walked. For 25 years, Blanche's world was reduced to a single room. It was a small, airless space in the attic of the family home. The only window was shuttered and padlocked, sealed against the light of day and the eyes of the outside world. The darkness was nearly absolute, broken only by the slivers of light that might have crept through the cracks. In this perpetual twilight, the vibrant young woman began to wither. Her life, once filled with music, laughter and society, was now defined by four walls, a straw mattress and suffocating silence. The passage of time lost all meaning, marked only by the infrequent delivery of scraps of food. Her existence was one of profound sensory deprivation. She had no one to talk to, nothing to read, nothing to see but the encroaching shadows. The room itself became a reflection of her decay. It was never cleaned. Food waste, human excrement and filth accumulated on the floor, creating a putrid environment. Insects and rats became her only companions in the dark. She lay on a rotting straw mattress, her body growing weaker with each passing year. The isolation was a form of torture far beyond the physical confinement, chipping away at her sanity, eroding the person she had once been. Her mind, starved of stimulation, began to retreat into itself. Her family lived their lives just downstairs. They hosted dinner parties, attended church, and continued their charitable work, all while their daughter and sister wasted away above them. Marcel Monnier married, had children, and pursued his career, his life of normalcy a stark, cruel contrast to the horror he helped perpetuate. They would have heard her in the beginning, her pleas, her cries, her desperate banging on the door, but over time, those sounds likely faded, replaced by a resigned silence or the incoherent mumblings of a mind that had fractured under the strain. The family simply learned to live with the secret, to walk past the locked door as if nothing lay behind it. The physical toll was immense. Without sunlight, her skin grew pale and translucent. Without proper nutrition, her body wasted away until she was little more than a skeleton. Her muscles atrophied from lack of use, leaving her unable to stand or walk. Her long, beautiful hair became a matted, tangled mess. The woman who emerged from that room after a quarter of a century would be unrecognizable, a ghost of her former self. She had entered the room as a vibrant woman of 27. She would leave it as a traumatized, emaciated creature who had not seen the sun or felt a kind touch in a generation. How could such a thing happen? How could a woman be held captive in her own home for 25 years without anyone intervening? The answer lies in, well, a confluence of factors: the family's power, the community's deference, and a collective willingness to look the other way. The Monniers were not just wealthy, they were influential. To question them was to risk one's own social standing. In the rigid social hierarchy of Poitiers, challenging a family of their stature was simply not done. Their word was taken as truth, and their privacy was considered sacrosanct. This, honestly, created a protective shield around their terrible secret. Over the years there were whispers. Some neighbors claimed to have heard screams and cries coming from the Monnier house. There were rumors that Blanche had gone mad, or that she had been sent away to a sanatorium. When friends asked after her, Madame Monnier would explain with a heavy heart that her dear daughter was unwell, her health too fragile for visitors. She painted a picture of a loving mother caring for an afflicted child, a narrative that played into her public persona as a pious, charitable woman. People accepted the story because, well, it was easier than confronting the horrifying alternative. The family's reputation was the perfect cover for their crime. There were also reports that a few people, over the years, tried to raise the alarm. Some accounts suggest that letters were sent to the authorities years before the final discovery, but were ignored or dismissed. Perhaps the officials who received them were friends of Marcel Monnier, or perhaps they simply could not believe that such a respected family could be capable of such an atrocity. The idea was just too monstrous, too out of place in their orderly world. The official channels, which should have provided a check on such power, failed. The system designed to protect citizens ultimately protected the perpetrators instead. The silence of Marcel Monnier is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the family's complicity. He was a man of the law, an educated professional who understood right from wrong. Yet, he allowed his sister to endure this torment for decades. He lived under the same roof, raised his own children there, and walked past her sealed room every day. His inaction was a daily endorsement of his mother's cruelty. Whether driven by fear of his mother, a desire to protect his career, or a cold indifference to his sister's suffering, his silence was essential. He was the guardian of the secret, the enforcer who ensured that the locked door remained locked. On May 23, 1901, the wall of silence finally cracked. The Attorney General of Paris received a mysterious, anonymous letter. The handwriting was neat, the message concise and horrifying. It spoke of a dark secret hidden in the city of Poitiers, inside the home of the highly respected Monnier family. The letter writer claimed that a woman was being held prisoner there, locked in a room for years, living in filth and starvation. The note was specific, naming the family and the nature of the crime. It read, in part, "Monsieur Attorney General, I have the honor to inform you of an exceptionally serious occurrence. I speak of a spinster who is locked up in Madame Monnier's house, half-starved and living on a putrid litter for the past 25 years. The authorities could have dismissed it as a malicious prank, a piece of gossip from a disgruntled neighbor or servant. Such anonymous tips were not uncommon, but something about the letter's tone, its chilling certainty, compelled them to act. The Attorney General forwarded the letter to the prefect of Poitiers, who, despite his likely acquaintance with the Monnier family, ordered the local police to investigate. The thought of what they might find was almost unbelievable, yet the accusation was too grave to ignore. A police commissioner and several officers were dispatched to 21 Rue de la Visitation, a respectable address that was about to become infamous. When the police arrived, they were met at the door by Madame Monnier. She was calm and composed, the picture of aristocratic grace. She denied everything, of course. She projected an air of indignation that such a preposterous accusation could be leveled against her. Her son, Marcel, was also present and supported his mother's denials. They tried to refuse the officer's entry, citing the sanctity of their home. But the police had a warrant and a duty to perform. They pushed past the protesting family members and began to search the meticulously clean and orderly house. The ground floor was immaculate. Everything was in its place, polished and perfect. As they ascended the stairs, however, a faint, foul odor became noticeable. It grew stronger as they reached the second floor. They followed the putrid smell to a locked door at the end of a hallway. It was padlocked shut. The officers demanded the key, but Madame Monnier refused. Without hesitation, the police broke down the door. What they found on the other side would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The neat, respectable world of the Monnier family had been violently torn open, exposing the horror it had concealed for so long. As the door splintered and gave way, the officers were hit by a wave of stench so overpowering that they recoiled. It was a thick, suffocating smell of filth, decay and human waste that had been festering in the sealed room for years. They covered their faces with handkerchiefs and forced themselves to enter, their eyes struggling to adjust to the total darkness within. One of the officers broke the padlocks on the shutters and wrenched them open. For the first time in 25 years, sunlight flooded into the room, illuminating a scene of absolute horror. The floor was covered in a thick crust of excrement, dirt and rotting food scraps. There, lying on a disintegrating straw mattress, was a human figure. It was Blanche Monnier. But she was no longer the beautiful woman from the photographs. She was a skeletal creature, her body emaciated and covered in sores. She weighed a mere 25 kilograms, or about 55 pounds. Her eyes, unaccustomed to the light, blinked in terror and confusion. Her long dark hair was a tangled, filthy mat, and her skin was stretched tightly over her bones. She was naked, huddled under a tattered, dirty blanket, surrounded by the vermin that had been her only companions. The police officers, hardened men accustomed to grim scenes, were speechless. One of the attending officers later described the scene in his report with chilling clarity. The unfortunate woman was lying completely naked on a rotten straw mattress. All around her was formed a sort of crust made from excrement, fragments of meat, vegetables, fish and rotten bread. We also saw oyster shells and bugs running across Mademoiselle Monnier's bed. The air was so unbreathable, the odour given off by the room was so rank, that it was impossible for us to stay any longer to proceed with our investigation. They wrapped Blanche in a clean blanket and carried her out of the house, away from the prison where she had spent half her life. As Blanche was taken to the hospital, the news of the discovery spread through Poitiers like wildfire. Crowds gathered outside the Monnier home, their initial disbelief turning to outrage. They had lived next to this horror for years, completely oblivious. The respectable facade of the Monnier family had been shattered, revealing the monstrous cruelty that lay beneath. The city that had once honoured Madame Monnier now reviled her. The same neighbours who had once looked up to the family now stared at their home with a mixture of anger and shame, wondering how they could have missed the signs, how they could have allowed such a thing to happen in their midst. The legal proceedings that followed were swift, but ultimately unsatisfying. Madame Monnier was arrested immediately, but her health, already frail, declined rapidly under the stress of her public disgrace and imprisonment. Just 15 days after Blanche's rescue, she died of heart failure before she could ever stand trial for her crimes. She took the full truth of her motivations and the dark secrets of her household to her grave, escaping legal justice. Her death left her son, Marcel, to face the courts alone, the sole living architect of his sister's long and torturous confinement. Marcel Monnier's trial became a sensation, drawing attention from all over France. He was charged with being an accomplice to the violence and illegal sequestration of his sister. His defense was simple and chillingly effective. He claimed he had never been violent towards Blanche and that, as an adult, she had been free to leave at any time. He argued that it was his sister's choice to remain in the room, suggesting she was mentally unstable and had refused to come out. The court initially found him guilty and sentenced him to 15 months in prison. However, on appeal, Marcel was acquitted on a legal technicality. The law required an act of violence, and the court ruled that simply failing to help his sister did not meet that specific legal standard. He walked free. The public was outraged by the verdict. Marcel Monnier, the educated man of law, had used his knowledge of that same law to escape punishment for his monstrous inaction. He was a pariah in Poitiers, his reputation destroyed forever. But he never spent a day in jail for his role in his sister's 25-year-long nightmare. The case exposed a loophole in the French penal code, highlighting the difficulty of prosecuting crimes of neglect and passive cruelty. Justice, in a legal sense, had failed Blanche Monnier. The system that had ignored her for decades ultimately failed to hold her tormentor accountable. For Blanche, life after rescue was not a happy ending. She was taken to a psychiatric hospital in Paris, where she received care and proper nutrition. She gained some weight and was kept clean and safe, but the psychological damage was too profound to be undone. The years of isolation, darkness, and abuse had shattered her mind. She was never able to fully reintegrate into the world. She suffered from a host of mental health issues, including schizophrenia, anorexia, and coprophilia, a direct result of her squalid living conditions. She spent the rest of her days in the sanatorium, cared for by strangers, living in the shadow of her past. She died in 1913, 12 years after her rescue, another victim of the family that was supposed to protect her. The story of Blanche Monnier is more than just a gothic horror tale. It is a profound and disturbing social commentary. It serves as a haunting reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a veneer of respectability and the terrible power of family secrets. The Monniers used their social standing as a shield, their reputation for piety and charity, a cloak to conceal an unimaginable crime. They proved that cruelty is not confined to the lower rungs of society, but can flourish in the most esteemed households, nurtured by pride, control, and a cold disregard for human life. The case also casts a long shadow over the community of Poitiers, and by extension, over society as a whole. It is a stark illustration of the bystander effect, the phenomenon where individuals are less likely to offer help to a victim when other people are present. The neighbours heard whispers. The authorities may have received warnings, but no one acted decisively. It was easier to believe the family's manufactured story than to confront a terrible truth. The silence of the community was a form of complicity, allowing the horror to continue unchecked for a quarter of a century. It begs the question, how many other locked doors and shuttered windows exist in our own neighbourhoods? Blanche Monnier's legacy is a tragic one. She is remembered not for the life she lived, but for the life that was stolen from her. She has become a symbol of extreme abuse and neglect, her name synonymous with the horrors of prolonged, hidden captivity. Her story has been retold in books, articles and documentaries, a cautionary tale that has lost none of its power to shock and disturb over a century later. She is the ghost in the attic, the woman who vanished in plain sight, a testament to the depths of human cruelty and the fragility of the human mind. Her suffering was real, and her memory forces us to remain vigilant. Ultimately, the tale of Blanche Monnier endures because it speaks to our deepest fears. It is the fear of being forgotten, of being helpless, of being betrayed by those who are supposed to love us most. It is the story of a mother's will turning monstrous, a brother's cold indifference, and a society that chose not to see. Blanche lived a life in the shadows, but her story, once brought into the light, serves as a permanent, chilling warning. It reminds us that evil can wear a polite face, and that the most terrifying prisons are not always made of stone and steel, but of silence and secrets.